A country sitting on some of the largest oil reserves on the planet is importing gasoline, not because it ran out of oil, but because the war it started destroyed its ability to refine it. Across Russia, drivers are sitting in lines that stretch for hours just to fill up their gas tanks. The government banned diesel exports not because it has too much, but because Ukrainian drones have been hitting refineries so hard that Russia can no longer produce enough fuel for its own people. That single image tells you more about Russia's economy than any official statement ever could. This is what's really happening with Russia's economy. But it's also a warning about what happens when a country bets everything on war and starts running out of things to bet with. And that affects all of us. And throughout this video, you're going to find out the reason behind this that nobody in Moscow wants to admit. Russia is not just losing money, it is losing something that money cannot buy. For years, the Kremlin sold a simple story. Russia had not only survived Western sanctions, it had thrived. Rising output, record low unemployment, growing wages. Putin himself repeatedly declared that the Russian economy had proven its resilience and that the West had failed to isolate Russia. The message from Moscow was that the war economy was working and that Russia was built to outlast anyone who tried to stop it. And for a while, the numbers seemed to back it up. Military spending surged, factories ramped up production, soldiers' families received large cash bonuses that boosted incomes in poorer regions. GDP grew. Russia defied predictions of collapse. But here's what that growth was hiding. Almost every ruble of it came from one place, the war machine. Defense-related sectors, weapons, ammunition, military vehicles were leading the growth, but most of the civilian economy was stagnating or shrinking. Motor vehicle production fell 23.6% in the first 11 months of 2025. Furniture dropped 7.5%. Healthcare shrank as money was redirected toward the military. The Kremlin wasn't building an economy, it was running one down. Here's where the story turns. Military spending in Russia doesn't just cost money, it actively destroys the conditions needed for an economy to function. More is spent to attract soldiers. Companies raise wages to compete. Prices go up. Inflation takes off. To fight the inflation that surged during the war, Russia's central bank raised interest rates all the way to 21%, the highest since the Soviet collapse. Even after 9 consecutive cuts, rates still sit at 14.25%, high enough to paralyze private investment and suffocate the civilian economy. The war puts money in the soldier's pocket but destroys the factory he left behind. And when you destroy more than you build, you don't get growth. You get inflation, stagnation, and a mess that takes decades to clean up. By early 2026, Russia's GDP growth hovered around 1%, and even that depended heavily on counting weapons factories as productive economic activity. Strip out defense, and the picture was dramatically worse. So, how did Russia fund all of this? The answer is simple: oil. For decades, oil and gas revenues have been the financial backbone of the country. But that backbone is cracking. In the first quarter of 2026, oil and gas revenues dropped 45% compared to the same period a year earlier. Over 11 months of 2025, that decline had already pulled roughly $50 billion out of Russia's budget. To plug the gap, Russia raised its corporate tax rate from 20% to 25%, created a new income tax bracket with a top rate of 22%, and raised VAT starting January 2026. No government does that because things are going well. It does that because it's desperate. And the strategic reserve? Russia had a sovereign fund built up during years of expensive oil, a kind of war savings account. The liquid assets of that fund, which reached 9.7 trillion rubles before the invasion of Ukraine, had fallen to around 3.6 trillion rubles by April 2026. More than two-thirds of the liquid reserve gone in 4 years of war. And then came the moment that made it impossible to look away. On the 8th of July 2026, Russia did something nobody expected. It banned diesel exports. Not because it had too much, but because it no longer had enough for its own people. Ukrainian drones had destroyed enough refining infrastructure that Russia was importing gasoline from India while its own gas stations ran dry. Exports had already collapsed 39% in June and 46% compared to the year before. And at a televised meeting with Putin, Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak said what nobody wanted to hear. The ban would take effect immediately. Outside, drivers were waiting hours in line just to fill their tanks. The world understood immediately what that meant. European diesel margins hit a record $60.17 per barrel the same day. Because when one of the planet's largest diesel exporters stops exporting, the market doesn't wait for an explanation. This wasn't just a fuel crisis, it was a signal. A country that built its entire geopolitical leverage on energy exports had been forced, by the war it started, to ban those same exports just to keep its own people moving. And this is where the Kremlin starts losing control of the narrative. 60% of Russians say the economy is getting worse. A year ago, that number was 39%. It's the first time in 2 decades that the majority of Russians think this way. 56% say their personal standard of living is falling. Food prices went up. In June alone, the price of potatoes rose 4.5% compared to the previous month. Inflation pulled back a little from its 2025 peaks, but the money in the average Russian's pocket bought less and less. And the frustration started leaking out. A Monaco-based influencer known for makeup tips posted a video on Instagram and brought down the wall of silence the Kremlin had spent years building. Victoria Bonya spoke for 18 minutes directly to Putin. The video passed 26 million views in 4 days, even with Instagram officially banned in Russia. "You know what the risk is?" she said. "That people will stop being afraid. They're being squeezed like a coiled spring, and one day that spring will shoot out." The Kremlin publicly responded. In a Russia where criticizing the government can cost you your freedom, that was not a small thing. Meanwhile, state-run Russian railways is drowning in debt it can no longer manage. The rail giant is pushing businesses to absorb more of the war economy's pain while facing falling demand, high borrowing costs, and investment in freefall. It is a portrait of what is happening across the Russian economy as a whole. Russia's biggest problem is not money, it's people. Workers are missing everywhere. The military pays more than most companies can afford to match. So workers go to war and factories sit empty. Even if Russia found the money to invest, it wouldn't find anyone to run the machines. And sanctions are making all of this worse. Equipment wears out, replacement parts don't arrive, software doesn't get updated. Russia's industrial base isn't just standing still, it's aging and becoming obsolete, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. And unlike money, skilled workers and technology don't appear overnight. Russia's economy is not collapsing, at least not in the way that word suggests. Grocery stores have food. Unemployment is low, partly because the military absorbed all the workers, the civilian economy let go, and state media keeps telling everyone that each difficulty is a necessary sacrifice for the motherland. But underneath that appearance of normality, the damage is piling up. Nearly half of every ruble the federal government spends goes to the war. Every ruble spent on a missile is a ruble that didn't go to a hospital, a school, or a road. And here is the most unsettling detail of all. Even if the war ended tomorrow, the recession wouldn't go away. In fact, it would get worse in the short term, because the weapons factories propping up Russia's GDP would suddenly have nothing to produce, and the civilian economy that was hollowed out to feed the war machine wouldn't be ready to fill that gap. Russia's leadership will have to explain, at some point, how a country with some of the world's largest energy reserves ended up importing gasoline and banning diesel exports just to keep its own people supplied. How a war that was supposed to be over in days turned into an economic weight now crushing the very population it claimed to be protecting. The vicious cycle is real. The damage is real. The pessimism at record levels among ordinary Russians is real. Russia's economy is no longer a story about resilience. It is a story about what happens when a country mistakes military spending for economic growth and keeps making that mistake year after year until the gas stations run dry. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And drop a comment. Do you think Russia's economy can hold together, or is the pressure already too much? See you in the next video.